James, a struggling yet compassionate man, gave away his last $50 to a pregnant woman in need, without a second thought. He returned home that night, broken and hungry, unaware that his small act of kindness was about to alter the course of his life forever. The next morning, as he opened the door to the sound of a knock, he froze in disbelief. Standing before him was a wealthy man in a professional suit, holding an envelope in his hand. Life, it seemed, was preparing to surprise James in ways he could never have imagined. Hello everyone, welcome to Narrative Whispers. Today I'm going to share another heartwarming story, so let's dive into it. The harsh sound of the alarm cut through the stillness of the room, jerking James awake. "Oh God, I'm late again," he muttered, half awake. He quickly jumped out of bed and rushed to freshen up. The cold water hit his face, making him flinch, but he didn't have time to care. He grabbed the clothes he'd left hanging behind the door the night before. They weren't exactly clean, just a bit worn, but it was all he had. Pulling on his clothes, he glanced at his shoes in the corner. They were old, beat up, and torn. With a quick sigh, he picked them up, rubbing them with his hands in a hopeless attempt to clean them. The dirt wouldn't budge. "Never mind," he mumbled to himself, slipping them on anyway. Then he spotted the tie, carelessly lying on the other side of the bed. He grabbed it and stood in front of the mirror, trying to tie it as best as he could. His reflection stared back at him, tired, but still pushing through. It was just another day, but somehow it felt like today might be different. James mumbled to himself, "Come on, James. You've got this. All the best, buddy." He tried to force a smile like he was practicing how to fake it. Trying to convince himself, he gave a small nod, then rushed toward the gate but suddenly stopped. "Oh no, I forgot my wallet," he muttered in frustration. The realization hit him like a wave, and he turned around with a look of regret on his face. Hurrying back to his room, he snatched up the wallet from the side table. It felt heavier than it should have. He opened it, and his heart sank as he saw only $50 left inside. A long sigh escaped his lips. It wasn't nearly enough for everything he had to take care of, but there was no time to dwell on it. With a hopeless expression, he shoved the wallet into his pocket, feeling the weight of his worries. He glanced at the clock, realizing just how late he already was. James had just recovered from a heart disease, something so unusual for a young man like him. But against all odds, he made it through. After a year of illness and isolating himself from the rest of the world, he was finally trying to get back into life. For the past 2 months, he had been desperately trying to find a job. He'd given interview after interview, but nothing was working out. Today, however, he felt like something might be different. He was going to apply at the same company where he had once been appointed as the product manager. It felt like the right opportunity, and for the first time in a while, he allowed himself to feel a flicker of hope. As James approached the entrance of the building, a wave of familiarity hit him. The air felt the same as it did when he worked here, and for a moment, a spark of hope lit up inside him. Maybe his old colleagues would be glad to see him, happy to have him back after all this time. As James walked towards the gates, he tried to slip through quietly, but the guards stopped him. "Hey, where do you think you're going?" one of them said, eyeing him from head to toe. Their expressions clearly reflected judgment: torn shoes, wrinkled clothes, and a tie that didn't sit quite right. James hesitated but tried to explain calmly, I used to work here. I'm a former employee." The guards exchanged a look and scoffed. "You? Worked here?" one said, almost laughing. "Do you know how many people try to sneak in with excuses like that?" James felt a lump form in his throat. "I'm telling the truth. I was the product manager here. Just check your records, please." But they weren't convinced. "All right, that's enough. You need to leave now before we call someone to escort you out," the other guard said, stepping closer as if to push him away. Just as James was about to plead further, a familiar voice called out from behind, "Wait!" "James?" James turned to see an old colleague, Mark, walking toward them. Mark's eyes widened in recognition. "It is you! I can't believe it! Guys, he's telling the truth! James worked here and he was one of the best we had!" The guards immediately backed off, looking a bit embarrassed. We didn't know, sir. Sorry about that. James gave Mark a grateful smile. Thank you, Mark. I owe you one. Mark chuckled and patted James on the shoulder. No worries. Come on, let's get you inside. As James stepped through the gates, a mix of relief and nervousness swept over him. He glanced back at the guards, who now avoided his gaze, and then forward, taking a deep breath. The first hurdle was over, but the day had only just begun. Inside the building, James took in the changes. The place felt unfamiliar, colder, and busier. He turned to Mark, the colleague who had helped him enter. Mark, where's Mrs. Carter? I want to talk to her, in case she needs a product manager. James asked, hopeful for a familiar face. Mark hesitated, his expression shifting to sadness. She passed away 2 months ago. It was sudden. James was stunned. Oh, I didn't know. She was such a kind woman. Mark nodded. Yeah, we all miss her. Things haven't been the same. We have a new boss now, a younger guy. Smart, but arrogant. Not many like him, but hey, work's work. Before James could respond, Mark glanced over his shoulder nervously. Here he comes. Listen, if you need to talk to him, do it in private. He's not exactly polite. Might make you feel embarrassed. James opened his mouth to ask something, but a sharp, cold voice interrupted him. With whose permission is someone like you, dressed like a beggar, allowed in my building? James stood there, stunned, trying to explain himself. You've got it wrong. I'm a former employee. But the new boss cut him off sharply, his tone icy and dismissive. Mark, I'm starting to think this is your doing. If this man isn't out of my building in the next minute, you're fired. Mark's face turned pale. His job was on the line, and the weight of responsibility for his family pressed hard on his shoulders. He looked at James with regret in his eyes. I'm sorry, buddy, Mark said quietly as they reached the main door. But I have a family to look after. I can't lose this job. Without waiting for a response, he turned and walked back inside, leaving James alone outside the building. James stood frozen for a moment, processing what had just happened. The same place where Mrs. Carter had shown him kindness and understanding was now where he was humiliated and thrown out like a stranger. He recalled how Mrs. Carter had been heartbroken when he had to leave because of his illness, how she had told him he'd always be welcome back. And now, here he was, disrespected and discarded. Tears welled up in his eyes as he turned and began walking home, each step heavier than the last. Hopelessness crept in, but all he could do was keep moving forward. James walked down the lonely street, his feet dragging as if the weight of the world was tied to them. The humiliation from earlier lingered like a dark cloud over his thoughts. He spotted an old wooden bench by the roadside and sank onto it, burying his face in his hands. For a moment, he let himself feel the pain, the loss of respect, the sharp contrast between his past and present. Suddenly, a soft sound broke his thoughts, a faint sob. James lifted his head, scanning his surroundings. A woman was slowly making her way to the bench, her figure hunched and trembling. She was pregnant, very pregnant, and her pale face and labored breathing told a story of pain. She hesitated for a moment before sitting down, clutching her belly tightly. James shifted uncomfortably, unsure if he should speak. But the sight of her tears stirred something in him. Gathering his courage, he asked softly, "Are you okay, ma'am?" The woman didn't look at him. She wiped her tears with shaking hands and replied in a whisper, "It's my last month. Just feeling a little overwhelmed." Her voice was frail, as if each word was a struggle. James studied her face. There was more to her pain than physical discomfort, but he didn't want to pry. "You should be inside," he said gently, glancing at the darkening sky. "The weather's turning cold. It's not good for you, or the little one." The woman lowered her head further, silent. Her lips trembled as if she wanted to say more, but couldn't bring herself to speak. James could sense her hesitation, her pride, or maybe her fear of judgment. Trying to ease the tension, he continued, "Ma'am, you don't look well." I don't mean to intrude, but if there's anything I can do, please let me know. I'd like to help." For the first time, she looked at him. Her eyes, red from crying, studied his face, as if trying to gauge if he was sincere. Then, lowering her gaze again, she clutched her belly and winced. "No, thank you," she muttered, her voice barely audible. "I'm fine." But James could see she wasn't fine. She was in pain, physical, emotional, or maybe both. He hesitated for a moment, then reached into his pocket and pulled out his worn wallet. Inside, he found the last $50 he had. With a deep breath, he took it out and placed it gently on the bench beside her. "I'm leaving this here," he said softly, his voice filled with sincerity. "If you need it, ma'am, it's yours. If not, maybe someone else will need it more." The woman stared at the money, her eyes widening in surprise. She looked up at James, her expression softening. "You're a kind man," she said, her voice filled with quiet gratitude. "I wish you happiness and peace." Her words hit James like a wave. For a moment he couldn't respond. He swallowed hard, feeling a lump in his throat, and blinked away the tears threatening to spill. He nodded faintly, stood up, and walked away without looking back. As he made his way home, he couldn't stop thinking about her words. They echoed in his mind, contrasting sharply with the harshness he had faced earlier. There are so many kinds of people in this world, he thought to himself. Some can't look past your appearance, and some can't help but show kindness. His steps grew lighter, and though the weight of his own struggles hadn't disappeared, a flicker of hope warmed his heart. As James returned home, the exhaustion of the day clung to him like a heavy shroud. He walked to his bed, dropped onto it without a care, and threw his tie to the side, just as it had been lying in the morning. His gaze fixed on the ceiling. Tears silently began to roll down his cheeks. The humiliation, the hopelessness, the emptiness, it all weighed heavily on his heart. His stomach growled, reminding him of how long it had been since his last meal. But he couldn't bring himself to eat, not that he had much to eat anyway. That night, James fell asleep on an empty stomach, the ache in his heart far greater than the hunger in his belly. Morning came, and sunlight spilled into the room, casting a faint warmth. James stirred and sat up, his body sluggish, his mind clouded. He wandered into the kitchen, hoping for a simple meal, maybe some milk and bread. But as he opened the cabinets and the fridge, all he found was emptiness. The stark reality hit him again. His savings had been drained by the relentless months of illness, and though he had recovered, rebuilding his life felt like climbing an endless mountain. He thought of the $50 he had given to the woman the previous evening. It was all he had left, and yet he didn't regret it. The image of her pained face flashed in his mind, and he muttered to himself, "I hope she's okay." As he turned back to the living room, intending to slump onto the couch and gather his thoughts, the sharp chime of the doorbell broke the silence. James paused, his heart skipping a beat. Visitors weren't common, especially now. He hesitated for a moment before walking to the door. With cautious hands, he opened it, unsure of what or who to expect. As James opened the door, he froze. Standing before him was the same arrogant boss who had humiliated him the day before. The man was dressed impeccably, but his expression was unrecognizable, vulnerable, almost pleading. James hesitated, stammering, "Sir, I'm sorry about yesterday. I won't come near the office again." Before James could finish, the man interrupted, tears streaming down his face. "Thank you," he said, his voice trembling. "I can never repay you." Confused, James stepped aside and invited him in. They sat in silence for a moment before James cautiously asked, "Why are you thanking me?" "What's going on?" The man wiped the tears from his eyes, his voice shaky but filled with regret. "Yesterday, you helped a woman. Do you remember?" James was taken aback. "Yes, but how do you know?" The man exhaled deeply, as if the weight of his emotions was too much to carry. "She's my wife." James froze. "Your wife?" he repeated, his voice low with disbelief. "But She didn't even have enough money for food, and she refused every help I offered. The man's face twisted in guilt. She's the wife of an arrogant, irresponsible man. I left her when she needed me most. James felt his heart tighten as the man continued. We got married, and things were good at first. But then I got so caught up in work, I didn't even notice how much she was suffering. She never complained. But there was this woman at the office. I got distracted by her. I did something unforgivable. I asked my wife to leave so I could live with someone else. James felt his stomach churn as he processed the words. How could you do that? He asked, his voice rising in disbelief. The man sank into himself, unable to meet James's eyes. I thought I could have it all. I thought I could live a double life without consequences, but I was wrong. The woman I left my wife for, she exposed my private business plans. I lost everything. My company went bankrupt. He paused, looking at James as if for some kind of understanding. I rebuilt my business but lost my peace. I was cursed, James. Cursed for what I did. I searched for her everywhere, but I couldn't find her. I didn't even know she was pregnant, until I got a call from the hospital yesterday. Some of my men were present there and knew that how desperately I was searching for her. They informed me about her condition. Hospital? James stammered, his voice thick with worry. Is she all right? The man nodded slowly, his face softening as he spoke. Yes, she's all right. She just brought into this world a baby boy. A son. A son who doesn't deserve a father like me. His voice grew heavier, the weight of his past decisions pressing down on him like a physical burden. But James, none of this would have been possible without you. Without that $50 you gave her. She was able to take the taxi to the hospital on time. Without that, she wouldn't have made it. James felt a sharp jolt of shock as the man continued. She never wanted my money, not since the day I left her. She never asked for any help from me. I'm here to thank you. Thank you for saving her life. If it wasn't for you, she would have gotten too ill. The birth was very complicated, but because of your help, she was able to get the care she needed. James stood there, frozen in disbelief. His small, almost unnoticed act of kindness, giving away his last $50, had actually saved a life. He had never expected anything like this. He had never thought that his gesture would lead to such a profound impact. I'm happy she's all right, James said softly, his words barely a whisper. It was all he could manage at that moment, too overwhelmed to say anything more. There was a brief pause between them before James finally spoke again, his curiosity getting the better of him. How did you know? I mean, she didn't even know my name. The man said, She told me about the man she met, the one who came out from the office building yesterday and sat on a bench, he explained, his tone softer now. She said she was coming from the opposite direction and she noticed you right away. She described your appearance to me, everything, except for the part where I humiliated you, which I regret deeply. She didn't mention that. Instead, she told me how you sat there, so kind and willing to help her despite your own struggles. She appreciated you. James felt a lump form in his throat. He had never expected that the woman he helped had such a perspective on his small gesture. The man continued, his eyes soft with regret. I knew right away that it was you, the same man who gave her that money, the one who saved her life. James had never thought of himself as capable of making a real difference in someone's life, but here he was, part of a story bigger than anything he had imagined. I'm sorry, James, the man said with a deep sigh. I know I hurt you yesterday, and I can't take that back, but now I just want to make things right. You have to get yourself ready because tomorrow you're going back to work. You're going to rejoin the team as a product manager. We need someone with your experience and knowledge. The man took out an envelope and put it on the table. Here is just a small gift from my side, as a token of respect and appreciation. Please accept it. James knew by the packaging that it was some cash money. He was stunned. His mind was racing. It was like a strange twist of fate. One moment he was being humiliated, and now the same man who had wronged him was offering him a second chance, a chance to return to the very office where he'd once worked. He had no idea what to say, but he knew this was an opportunity he couldn't ignore. The man gave him a small, yet sincere smile. "I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I cannot lose such a gem like you." "Thank you, James. You've shown me more about kindness and humanity than I ever thought I could learn. I'll be waiting for you tomorrow." James looked at him for a moment, trying to gather his thoughts. "I don't know what to say, but thank you too," he finally replied, his voice catching in his throat. "I'll be there tomorrow." As the man left, James stood at the door for a while, his mind swirling with thoughts. His life had changed in ways he couldn't have predicted. What had started as a small act of kindness had now come full circle, offering him a chance to start anew. And maybe, just maybe, the world had a way of balancing things out after all. Thank you for listening to James's story. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share it with someone who loves compassionate and inspiring tales. See you in the next story on Narrative Whispers.